Dr. Lloyd, your arrival as director largely coincided with the creation of the National Directorate. What was your experience of the National Directorate and its ability to coordinate or take decisions?
Well, if you look at some of the documents that have been submitted, my correspondence with the National Directorate, I think that speaks to the fact that I did not have a very high opinion of that organisation. I felt that they were poor at making decisions. We know from Dr. Gunson's own statements that he felt that he had no authority, and that's the case. He was not, the National Directorate wasn't set up to have a line of authority. On the other hand, if you had recognised that, you could have worked with people to get agreement. And what we saw was, as we mentioned earlier, as you brought up earlier, there was the last of the Transfusion Centre directors' meetings. And in dissolving that meeting, you removed a degree of coordination which would have been possible, bringing all the directors together with the National Director, and together with people from the Department of Health, the DHSS is what it was at different times, and a representative from the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service. And that is, I mean, that's mentioned by Dr. Eva Brooks in her informal minutes of that meeting, saying, you may come to rue the moment that you agree to this meeting ending. So the National Directorate, to me, had ended up severing certain lines of communication, so that, I don't know how other directors felt, but I felt that I was sort of fed small snippets of information, and really didn't have a lot of input. And sometimes that meant that you didn't understand the context of some things that were happening. So yes, the National Directorate to me was a poorly put together it could have functioned a lot better within the confines of what it was given. Sorry, I ramble a bit.
No, that's quite all right. Now, I want to ask you to look at a document which was produced by you in March of 1991, so approximately 3 years into the life of the National Directorate. NHBT 0001864. So the document should be on your screen, Dr. Lloyd. It's Framework for a National Directorate of the Blood Transfusion Service in the post-White Paper era, and it's stated on page 6 of
right.
14th of March 1991. You say in the introduction that since the creation of a National Directorate there have been significant changes in the NHS. You described with links with regional health authorities starting to weaken, and then you say it raises the question of a future role for a National Directorate, and you suggest that there is an important and valuable role for it, covering in particular the areas of information on transfusion medicine and transfusion management and the provision of a public face. And then if we just go to page 4... if we pick it up halfway down the page, under the heading, The Authority for a National Directorate. I'll just wait till we get there.
Are we on the right page?
Yeah, we're on the right page, but we need the bottom half of the page. So. Yes, so the Authority for a National Directorate. You say, at present, the National Directorate is officially working to a brief dating from 1988. That brief is out of date. And then, skipping over a couple of lines, its long-term role appears uncertain unless a clear role can be developed which fits with the current white paper philosophy. And then you refer to the National Directorate and the CBLA. And then over the page, next page, you set out a proposal for the way forward. I'm not going to go through the detail of that, but just pick it up at the summary, bottom half of the page. A redefinition of the role of the National Directorate with a clear brief to support the UK transfusion centres and to provide cost-effective information, public relations and certain coordinating functions is proposed. Now, we know this isn't what happened, and in due course we have the National Blood Authority, which I'll come on to in a couple of minutes. But what was it that led you to advocate this redefined role for the National Directorate? What were you hoping it would achieve?
Oh, goodness. Yes, I was obviously... I was trying to look for something that didn't require the National Directorate to be completely redeveloped. In other words, you didn't want to have to go to the Department of Health and say, you know, create a different beast. So what could the National Directorate do that would deliver, you know, value to the transfusion centres? So I'm looking at certain things. As an individual transfusion centre director, I was obviously heavily consumed in running, you know, what was then a multi-million-pound operation. And the amount of time available to do some of these things was limited. So, the time to travel to, you know, international meetings and get a good understanding of what was going on from around the world, you know, that would have been something that the National Directorate could have done, because the National Directorate doesn't have to actually manage anything other than a handful of people in an office. So I was looking for things that they could deliver which would help the transfusion services. And so I think that's sort of where I was going. Gosh, it's a long time since I wrote this. I don't know, is there anything else you'd like to dig into on it?
No, just
to say, I was just flying a kite.
Now, we know that there was then a consultation on forming a National Blood Authority, and there's a response to that consultation by the Northern Region Blood Transfusion Service at DHSC 0004584_039. And if we go to the third page, under the heading Introduction, it's picking it up, third paragraph. In essence, the NRBTS believes that strong local management with local accountability provides the best option for the future. This option is outlined in the section Preferred Future Management Arrangements. Central coordination is available through a small organisation operating on behalf of regional transfusion centres. And then the next paragraph, it's accepted that the strongly independent stance that we would like to take, whilst possibly appropriate for ourselves, will not be suitable for a number of transfusion centres. It's also accepted that BPL requires more support to survive. And then, if we just keep the whole of it on screen, Sally, I think it's fine. The next paragraph, we've assessed various options against the standards that we believe appropriate for a transfusion service in the United Kingdom. And you refer to a proposal put forward by the transfusion centre directors and managers. And then you say the NBA proposal as presented in the consultation paper does not meet our criteria on a number of important points. These are amplified in the section perceived problems in the NBA proposal. It does, however, address the national coordination question, the need for a national image for the NBTS and the link between the NBTS and BPL. We therefore support the formation of an MBA, but believe it should be in the form of the revised proposals from the Transfusion Centre directors and managers. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole document, Dr. Lloyd, but can you tell us essentially what it was that you were proposing and why you were not supporting the idea of an entirely national blood authority, essentially a single transfusion service?
Yeah, as I said in that document, it what we were proposing may not have been entirely appropriate for every transfusion centre. I'm certainly aware that quite a number of transfusion centre directors strongly wanted a single central organisation. I guess I had found that I had a really good group of staff in the transfusion centre at many levels. And we were able to work together to make changes, and we could make them quickly, relatively quickly. Some we could make very quickly. So you can get things done with a good management team and with good staff. You can get them done locally. Once you become national, particularly in the early years, you've got an enormous task to try and bring disparate organisations together. And certainly from my point of view, and as mentioned elsewhere, I didn't really want to be in a position of just being told what to do. One was aware that the NBA changed some of the things that we did quite quickly. Stupid things, changing telephone systems, which removed direct outside lines into our dispatch department, apparently. And I quote that from someone who worked there after I left. So I'm not a lover of big organizations, I have to say. I'm not a lover of the big bureaucracy. So yeah, I pushed for something to keep us independent, but not standards. How you meet them doesn't matter. It's meeting the standard. And if you can meet that standard or exceed it, then that's good. So it's not saying let's just forget about standards and we'll do our own thing. We'll do our own thing and meet what is appropriate. So yeah, you see me being pretty clear on my views.
And I understand from your statement that the establishment of the NBA in the form it ultimately took was a factor in you deciding to leave your post and move on to pastures new.
Have to put it in context. When I became director, I had said to myself, and I think I've written that in my witness statement, that I didn't want to stay in that position for too long. One of the reasons for that was that I had met a number of other transfusion centre directors and sort of felt that perhaps, they'd started off with great ideas and so on, but had rather stagnated. And I didn't want to let myself get into that position. So once, by the time the NBA came into... So the combination of my own idea that I didn't want to stagnate and the fact that the NBA would really take away my ability to get things done that I wanted to do, and I'd be subject to an organization, this sort of rather unknown organization, yes, that gave me the impetus to put my CV, my resume out there.
Now, I'm going to ask you next about the relationship with haemophilia centres. Just before I ask you about that from your perspective as director of the Regional Transfusion Centre, Can I just come back to the short period of time you worked at the Haemophilia Centre during your registrar years? Do you have any recollection of what Dr. Jones's approach to treatment or treatment philosophies were, based on your own very short time there?
Yeah, very short time. I mean, he was a great advocate for home treatment, and having, knowledge of what haemophilia had been like for individuals prior to the availability of factor concentrate, and then prior to the move to home treatment, you realize that home treatment offered a terrific improvement in life. Now we know what happened, but just the very fact of he wanted patients to live a more normal life if they could. And so, yes, home treatment was I think, the bedrock of what was done at that haemophilia centre. But I didn't have time to go into, what his philosophy was and how long he'd gone down that path. And after that, it becomes hearsay.
One of the documents in the 80s tells us that the haemophilia patients in the northern region area were all managed from the Newcastle Centre rather than their own more local unit. Do you have any knowledge as to why that was the case?
I really don't know. I mean, I know that there were some sub-centres, but I don't even really know how they were staffed or managed. It did seem to be that Newcastle was the centre that managed and offered management to patients in the whole region.
Now, I'm going to look in a moment at a letter that you wrote at the time of the HIV litigation. But before we do that, just in broad terms, as I understand the position, in relation to commercial concentrates, the regional transfusion service had nothing to do with the ordering or stocking or supply of commercial concentrates. That was all dealt with directly by the Newcastle Haemophilia Centre. Is that right?
Haemophilia Centre and their pharmacy organisation, we did not order, choose, supply any of those commercial products.
And in relation to the NHS concentrates, the BPL products, and we'll explore issues of plasma supply a little later on, but as I understand it, the Regional Transfusion Centre did have a role there in the sense it received those products from BPL and it supplied those products to the Haemophilia Centre.
Yes. Without going too much into semantics, when we say supplied, I mean, that was just an issue of a matter of transferring the product. We had a truck that went down to Bioproducts, now BPL, with plasma. It came back with finished product. The factor 8 was put into refrigeration, and then it was for the Haemophilia Centre, the RVI, to collect that product. I don't recall them actually ever ordering it. They didn't sort of say, can you supply us, 10 boxes? It was a case of, we've got the product from BPL, come and get it.
And if we look then at the letter from the time of the HIV litigation, TYWE 00000064, please, Sally. If we go to the second page, it's a letter from you to Mr. Slack of Crute Solicitors, heading HIV litigation. You say, attached is a fairly brief set of answers to the questions put by you recently. As I only became director/general manager in late 1988, my involvement with, and hence knowledge of certain aspects of this litigation, is limited. And you then refer to having gone through a large quantity of files created by Dr. Collins and some files dating back to Dr. Murray, and you say clear from my examination of the files that very little was put to paper by the previous director, or if it was, no copies now exist at the Transfusion Centre. And then if we go to the next page, there's a heading at the top of the page, RTC responsibilities in relation to the Haemophilia Centre. The transfusion service responsibility to the Haemophilia Centre in this region is little different to its responsibility to any other health service department or unit. We provide within our capabilities the products that are requested by the Haemophilia Centre. Some of the products we provide are locally produced, including cryoprecipitate and individual packs of fresh frozen plasma. As far as the supply of Factor VIII and Factor IX are concerned, we've acted purely in a handling intermediary position between the Blood Products Laboratory at Elstree and the Haemophilia Centre. Because we have a vehicle travelling to Elstree carrying raw plasma to that factory and the van is then returning to Newcastle, we bring back all the Factor VIII and Factor IX allocated to the northern region and then dispatch it to the Haemophilia Centre. At various times, we've held some of this product in stock, awaiting instructions from the Haemophilia Centre to have it sent across. As mentioned elsewhere, there have been times when it has been necessary to remind the Haemophilia Centre that supplies of NHS Factor VIII are available and awaiting collection. Just pausing there in relation to that last sentence, Dr. Lloyd, you refer in your statement to Dr. Collins showing you boxes of Factor VIII in a walk-in fridge that Dr. Collins told you the Haemophilia Centre was reluctant to take. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And I think you have also supplied a document which is a letter from Dr. Collins to Dr. Jones, in which I think she uses the phrase embarrassingly large supply that hasn't been shifted.
Yes, and we'll just look at that. TYWE.
But it is.
Yeah, TYWE 000015_002. If we just zoom in on the text, please, Sally. It looks like it's 26th of August 1983, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yes, that's what I thought.
And it's from Dr. Collins. Thank you, Sally. I think that's right. It's from Dr. Collins to Dr. Jones. Dear Peter, we have an embarrassingly large supply of BPL Factor VIII in stock. How about it? It would appear from what Dr. Collins related to you, I think, and what you relate in this document, that the transfusion services understanding was that the Newcastle Haemophilia Centre used to a very substantial extent commercial concentrates. Is that correct?
As far as I know, they did. We know, and I'm sure we'll get into this at some stage, there was very limited supply of BPL Factor VIII. It would not have met the regional demand, particularly once you start a fairly aggressive home treatment policy. But despite that, they were still, obviously was still some product not getting used immediately. So yes, they used a lot of commercial product and would concentrate, and you see that in other documents that have been submitted.
And if we go to the next page of this document, I just pick up on an answer you gave to one of the questions. So it's TYWE 000064.
4, yeah.
And it'll be page 4, please, Sally.
Okay.
So question, or paragraph 5 says, to what extent were there shortages of Factor VIII? And this, as I understand it, was part of your answer. Factor VIII has, since the 1970s, been produced by the Blood Products Laboratory at Elstree in quantities less than those required for the treatment of the haemophiliacs in this country. The level of shortage in each region has varied because of the supply of raw plasma from which factor VIII is made. As mentioned elsewhere, I believe that this region took a decision in the 1970s to purchase commercial factor VIII rather than invest in the transfusion centre with a view to producing more plasma. Can you recall, Dr. Lloyd, what the basis was for your understanding that there had been a positive decision by the Regional Health Authority, I assume it's the Health Authority you're referring to there, to invest in commercial concentrates rather than rebuilding the transfusion centre?
Okay. At the time I wrote that, I would have been fairly heavily influenced by comments made by my predecessor, Dr. Anne Collins, because I wrote that before I was director. And I would have had, I wouldn't have seen some of the documents that you now have given me access to over decisions by the Regional Health Authority. So I am here, I think, pretty much quoting the view that came from my predecessor without having sort of hands-on evidence to support those statements.
And I should say, I'm not going to go to it now, sir, but we do have a draft statement from Dr. Collins, produced, I think, again, for the purposes of the HIV litigation. I won't take time with it now, but for the transcript, it's TYWE 00000022, and I may come back to it in the course of Dr. Lloyd's evidence, but we do have Dr. Collins's input there.
Yes, I have read that.
There are a couple of comments that Dr. Actually, having said we won't look at that document, I'm going to suggest we do. Sorry, Sally, could we have TYWE 5022? So this is the draft statement from Dr. Collins. And I just want to pick up on what she says at pages 4 to 5 and then ask if you have any observations or any reflections of your own based on your conversations with her. So if we go to page 4, please, thank you. If we pick it up halfway down the page, a further difficulty arose from the arrangements which were made from about 1980 onwards for the distribution of factor VIII. The system introduced at that time was known as the pro rata arrangement, by which RTCs were intended to receive back amounts of blood products in proportion to the amount of blood plasma sent by regional transfusion centres throughout England and Wales. Because some regional transfusion centres, such as the Leeds Centre, sent a disproportionately large amount of blood plasma, the Northern Transfusion Service lost out, even when the amount of blood plasma sent to Elstree increased. Do you have anything or any particular insight into or understanding of what Dr. Collins had in mind there, this sense that the pro rata system somehow was stacked against the Northern region in some sense?
Well, not particularly against the Northern region. It happened to act against the Northern region. If you look at one of the charts that I presented in my witness statement showing the pro rata distribution of products in general to the Northern region, it shows that over a period of I think it was actually only a couple of years this data relates to. I just didn't happen to have a larger range of data. But you can see that in that chart that the amount of plasma being sent to BPL from the Northern region stayed the same, but the amount of product that came back diminished. And that was a fact. That's how the pro rata system worked. You took the total quantity supplied by all transfusion centres and you divvied it up accordingly, the production accordingly. So if some centres produce more but others stay the same, the ones who stay the same are going to get less product back. And that's what Dr. Collins is referring to here. And as I say, I did produce a small chart showing that in operation.
I'll certainly come on to some of the charts that you produced, Dr. Lloyd, in the course of the afternoon. And then if we just go to the next page, page 5, so still in Dr. Collins' statement, picking it up in the second paragraph, she says, it became apparent that there was a preference at the Haemophilia Centre for commercially produced factor VIII blood product for the following reasons. And then she sets out 3, solubility, allergic reactions, and a more attractive presentation of commercial factor VIII. Now, that's what Dr. Collins was saying. Do you have any direct evidence or information of your own as to what might have been the preference of Dr. Jones for commercially produced factor VIII product? Something you ever discussed with him?
I mean, no, I don't think I discussed it with him. I mean, I was certainly aware because whilst I was the senior registrar at the Royal Victoria Infirmary, we often treated haemophiliacs who came in after hours when the Haemophilia Centre wasn't open. And we used the product that was allocated for that patient. If that patient was on a certain commercial product, that's what we used. And it's true, the commercial factor VIII was more easily soluble. In other words, you could put the distilled water in, I think it was distilled water, into the vial and dissolve it much more quickly than you could the BPL product. So I actually, have experienced that. I don't know really enough to say about the allergic reactions, the rate of those, but obviously Dr. Collins had some knowledge of that. But I don't know what specifically Dr. Jones was saying about that, but it is the case that product, the BPL product, was less easily to use, and it wasn't presented, if you like, in a nice package. It didn't come with with everything together, so a little more difficult to use.
And then just before we move more generally to issues relating to plasma supply, but while still on the topic of haemophilia treatment, can I ask you to look at NHBT 00788890_022. And when it comes up, Dr. Lloyd, you'll see it's a letter from you. So it's dated the 13th of November 1986. Yes. It's addressed to the parents of a boy with haemophilia, and it refers to the possibility of collecting plasma from the parents to provide cryoprecipitate for treating their son. Now, I'm not going to ask you anything about the individual family concerned, but just as a broad topic, this idea of what I think you referred to in your statement as family-specific cryoprecipitate, did that take off? Was that something that was done, and had it ever been contemplated before this?
I don't recall it being done at other times. I read this letter, and it obviously brought the issue back to mind, but it wasn't something that I was aware of it certainly wasn't a major component of what we were doing in the transfusion centres. We were obviously prepared to do it, but I don't recall it becoming a frequent, certainly not a frequent issue. We might have done others, but I'm sorry, I can't remember now.
And do you know whether what had triggered this this possible arrangement was concern about viral infection, or whether it was unrelated to that issue?
No, I don't know. I didn't deal with the parents, and certainly, it was Dr. Jones who worked with the parents to get a suitable means of treatment. So I don't know what discussions took place to come to this conclusion. So I'm sorry, I can't help you further on that one.
Thank you. We can take that down, Sally. So I'm going to ask you now to look at 3 documents, all of which I'm afraid predate your time as director, but they're 3 short documents relating to issues of plasma supply and meeting targets and so on. And then I want to ask you about some observations you make in your witness statement. So the first document is DHSC 0002247_077. This is a letter dated the 18th of October 1984 from the Regional General Manager at the Northern Regional Health Authority to the Department of Health. And we can see it's headed Supply of Plasma to the Blood Products Laboratory. It says this: your letter dated 10 August 1984 on this subject was discussed by the Regional Health Authority at its recent meeting when commitment to achieving the target for this region was reaffirmed, but only a qualified assurance with regard to timing could be given in the light of additional capital and revenue resources required, and more particularly the need to build up the number of plasma donors in the region. In this latter connection, the recent closure of factories in the region has had a considerable effect on the ready availability of blood donors. I appreciate you wouldn't have seen this letter at the time, Dr. Lloyd, and indeed it doesn't even appear to have been copied to Dr. Collins. But it suggests an in-principle commitment to meeting the targets and presumably the ultimate objective of self-sufficiency, but not an equivalent guarantee of being able to do so. Is that more broadly a fair reflection of your understanding of the position at around this time and the position you then inherited later in the 80s?
Yes, I think so. I think there's another document also from the Regional Health Authority, probably from, was it the Regional Director of Resources, which I think may have followed up this letter, which you also, I didn't see at the time, which gives it perhaps a little more background to it. But yes, my understanding was that we're not going to put a lot of money into the centre. It's going to be expensive. We have limited resources. And so at the moment, yes, when you read it, you say, yes, well, we'd like to go along with you, but actually we're not going to. That's what it appears to say. And the little bit about the closure of factories and so on is just a little bit of icing on the cake to try and show that, it was going to be difficult.
And then I'll just pick up two other documents. They're not, I think, the one you're referring to, but I'll try and find the reference to that later. So the second is a letter from Dr. Collins to the DHSS, May of 85, DHSC
yes.
0002269_021. So 1st of May 1985, headed Plasma Procurement for BPL. I'm sorry for my late reply to your letter, read Plasma Procurement for BPL. The matter was raised at the recent Regional Health Authority meeting, members being advised that additional finances would be required for the proposed plan and that information was still being collected. I'm therefore not in a position to assure you yet of any increased supply from this region. The new transfusion centre building should become available later this year, thus resolving one constraint upon us. The proposal being considered comprises a small increase in routine blood donations, use of SAG-M for a proportion of donations, and the shortfall being made up by plasmapheresis. I will let you know when any agreement is reached. So it would appear that Dr. Collins is effectively awaiting approval from the Regional Health Authority to take the steps outlined, fairly modest steps, but potentially outlined in the 3rd paragraph of her letter.
Yes. She felt she couldn't, you can't spend money that you don't have, you don't have the authority to. And so the two things there, the bags containing the optimal additive SAG-M were more expensive, and of course, expensive operation. There was a small plasmapheresis centre in the new building with a small number of units. We saw that in the Medicines Control Agency inspection report earlier, where I think they mentioned 8 hemonetics machines, although that might have been a little bit later than this. Yes, it was the next year, wasn't it, that report? So she couldn't go ahead with some of the things that she would have liked to have done because she didn't have the funding to do it.
And then I think we see that perhaps most starkly in the third letter I wanted to ask you to look at briefly. It's TYWE 00000, so 5 zeros, Sally, 51 _ 004. It's almost illegible, but I'm going to read it out. So it's Dr. Collins to Dr. Jobling, a pathologist in
Jobling.
At the Preston Hospital, and it's 9th of December 1985, I think. And she says, I must point out that the Regional Health Authority does not fund this service to be self-sufficient in plasma products. And then she says, however, there has been recently a shortfall in supplies of processed material from BPL, and we will now be able to let you have a small additional number of units as they are correcting this. So, again, I think fairly obvious what Dr. Collins is saying in the first main paragraph there, insufficient funding for self-sufficiency. Yes. So those letters really then lead, I think, to some observations you make in your witness statement, Dr. Lloyd. So if we could have on screen, please, Sally, WITN 6935001, and we go to page 39. So paragraph 29 says barriers to achieving plasma targets, and you identify 3 points there. Prior to 1985, limited and outdated facilities, which you've already told us about in the course of your evidence. And then the centre's belief that a large proportion of whole blood was required by the hospitals it supplied is the second bullet point. Does that take us back to the issue you referred to earlier about the very substantial proportion of blood that was, or the products being supplied in the form of whole blood, rather than, for example, the use of the red cells and SAGM?
Yes. I mean, when I started first, I'm just reiterating what I said before, the centre seemed to think, at least its laboratory staff at that time, not later, at that time, seemed to believe that what the hospitals needed was whole blood, and that's what we were going to give them. And we didn't fractionate, we didn't separate a lot of the whole blood into components as we should have done. And of course, you couldn't put it into an optimal additive because we didn't have the bags and the money to, buy them. So that's definitely what I was talking about, and that's what I'm talking about here.
And then the third bullet point, prior to 1988, the RHA's approach to funding plasma collection, and that's really the point that emerges from the correspondence that we've just looked at. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Can we then just look at some of the graphs that you've exhibited to your statement? If we start with WITN 6935013, so this is the supply of fresh frozen plasma from the northern region to BPL, 1981 to 1985. And can you just well, I think this is probably one of the pieces of information you were referring to earlier. The amount,
yes,
in terms of volume supplied, remains relatively static during that period. There are increases and decreases year in, year out, but there's not a huge difference. But the percentage, in terms of the percentage contributed by all centres, we can see significantly reduces over that period, which results under the pro rata system with the northern region receiving less by way of BPL factor concentrates. Is that right?
Yes. I mean, you're talking about a close to 50% reduction in products sent back to the northern region from whatever BPL was producing at the time. And the northern region hadn't done anything other than stood still. The rest of the world had moved on.
And then if we turn to WITN 6935003, we have, I think, now information about the same thing, in the sense it's plasma dispatched to BPL. This is purely relating to the northern region, and it's now for the period from the 85-86 to 93-94, and we can see a very significant increase in the amount of plasma being dispatched to BPL over that period. We'll look at a handful of further documents, Dr. Lloyd, but essentially, how was that achieved, that increase?
Okay. If I may start with what I was thinking at the beginning of that period, perhaps just before I became director, which was that probably the only way to get a major change in plasma production was to go full force into plasmapheresis, as the way some other centres have done. Leeds has been mentioned before. But once I sort of got into the job, I realised that we had a terrific opportunity to separate a lot more blood. And instead of sending out whole blood, we would produce products where we were able to salvage the removed plasma for this purpose and send the hospitals either concentrated red cells, or we reduced that, or we sent them something in an optimal additive. So we did change our view. We ran a small plasmapheresis operation within the centre. We were able to do that with very little extra cost because we had the facility. We had the machines there, and it needed a bit of staffing and organisation, and that produced about 4 tons of plasma per year throughout this period. So the bulk of this change is just by changing the amount of blood that is processed and how we processed it. So one of the things we did was we organised meetings with the haematologists and their senior blood bank staff from across the region, and they all came to the centre for a day, and we were able to present information showing them how much whole blood they were using and how that compared to the rest of the country, how much whole blood was being returned unused, and we initiated a discussion with them. And I have to say, they were extremely cooperative. The haematologists across the region understood that whole blood is not a good product to use, generally. Few specific cases, maybe. Concentrated red cell products and using plasma products and so on as needed was something they recognized, and they were able to change and deal with their staff and surgeons, anaesthetists and so on at the hospitals, and allow this change to happen. And I think we did it in 2 stages. We sort of set a target, and then we went to a second stage after a further meeting and said, well, can we reduce this further? And they said, yes, of course. And by the end of that period, whole blood was a rare beast. I mean, well under 1% of our output was whole blood. So most of this was done by working with the hospitals, with people who understood, transfusion and blood banking, And we also changed our manufacturing techniques to allow us to produce more plasma per pack. We became probably the biggest user of an automated or semi-automated system for separating blood, the OptiPress system from Baxter Corporation, which allowed us to eke out, you know, that extra 10, 20 mils of plasma from a lot of the products we produced, at the same time as improving the quality of the product. So it was a multifaceted change, but it was done with very little in the way of capital investment.
And if we just look at one further graph on this topic, WITN 6935002, this is, I think, a visual depiction of what you've just told us. So percentage of red cells issued as whole blood
Correct.
for the period 85, 86 to 93, 94. And we can see its decline to, as you just indicated, being a tiny proportion, if any, being issued by the time we get to 93, 94. Is there any reason why this could not have been done significantly earlier than it was?
Well, it could certainly have been done earlier. I mean, as I said, just before I started as director, my views were different. I didn't really appreciate the extent of what we could do. It did take a year before I really got into it. So yes, it could have been done. Of course, it could have been done. Newcastle was, even before the move to the new centre, we were at the top of the league table of producing whole blood. So other centres were able to reduce it, reduce the use of whole blood. So there's no reason why we shouldn't. I would say that I think, and I don't have terrific information, the northern region probably had fewer haematologists in post, particularly outside the, a couple of the big centres, which would have made it more difficult to do. You need a good haematologist with good transfusion knowledge who can talk as an equal to the surgeons and the anaesthetists about this. So yes, we could have started, it could have been started earlier. It would not have been as easy as it was for me to do at this time with so many haematologists in post.
Now, you told us a few moments ago that when you started out as director, at the forefront of your thinking had been using plasmapheresis more. I'm not going to go to the document because you've explained what happened in relation to that, but for the transcript, there was a report which you produced in around, I think, 1988, which is at NHBT 000158, which had a proposal at that time for increasing plasmapheresis. If we just go, however, to the graph,
correct, yes,
the graph which you produced relating to plasmapheresis donations, which is WITN 6935012. And we can see from this an increase in plasmapheresis donations, again over the period 85, 86 to 93, 94. So would it be right to understand, although this wasn't the central plank of your strategy for increasing the supply of plasma, nonetheless you were able to achieve a significant increase in plasmapheresis collection?
Yes, we got us a small plasmapheresis unit, got some great staff together to run it, and got it up quite quickly to producing the 4 tons, and we sort of left it at that because we seem to be able to produce plasma from other sources, and plasmapheresis plasma is more expensive. The physical location within the transfusion centre had originally been designed as a location for blood donor sessions. So we with a very small pheresis section at the far end of it, with room for 2 machines. I think that was in the original plans drawn up by Faulkner Browns. So we did a bit of a remake, turned it over to Plasmapheresis, and then somewhere in the middle of that, with a lot of help from the staff running that unit, we remodeled it to increase its efficiency, using some ideas that they came up with.
And I think we can get a snapshot of the plasmapheresis facilities at NHBT 0003365. This is a short note from Dr. Gunson, 14th of August 1989, notes on visit to Northern RTC. He discusses issues relating to the plasma targets and the poor record of the past in the first section. And then section 2, plasmapheresis, we can see Plasmapheresis Centre in RTC, 8 machines in operation. He gives then details of the staffing, and then 2.4, currently there are 1,000 donors on the panel which have been recruited in the last 6 months. Prior to the new centre in being opened in 1985, would plasmapheresis have been possible in the old regional transfusion centre?
I don't think so. I mean, that facility was crammed, physically not set up for this. I'm trying to think. I've trying to reimagine the building. I really cannot think of anywhere in that building where you could have set up plasmapheresis. You know, you might have built another shed, another hut in the grounds and used it as a plasmapheresis centre, but not in the existing structures. I don't think so.
And then if we look at WITN 6935024, and now this is just on the topic of autologous transfusion. I don't think we need to look at anything other than the first paragraph, which explains that there's a pre-deposit autologous transfusion service for hospitals within the northern region. Services provided on request and aims to ensure that any patient due for planned surgery and for whom there's a likelihood that blood will be required will be able to benefit from it. Was there the potential for any wider use of this as a method of collection?
Yeah. Autologous is it's an interesting topic. I think, and there is some documentation earlier than this date where I actually sort of say I don't think it's really a very good idea, or it's not that it isn't a good idea, that it probably isn't necessary from a safety point of view. Perhaps by this time I'd got to a point where perhaps I shouldn't be quite so sure of myself. And there were patients and their physicians, their doctors, who really felt that they wanted their patients to have autologous transfusion for, particularly for planned surgery. And so we were fortunate in being able to offer it. It was a small operation, but I was very concerned that if autologous transfusion was carried out locally with poor control, you had the risk of blood going to the wrong person or not being stored properly, not being labeled properly. And that would negate the benefit that autologous transfusion was bringing to you. So we did offer it. It didn't have a great uptake. I think it's at the end of the contract. There's a list of hospitals who'd used it in the previous year, and I can't remember if it's 6 in this document or 9. But it's a small number and a small number of units. But it was an option for people, and once you realise, particularly once you start thinking beyond HIV, then autologous certainly makes more sense. If you only think of HIV, then because of the very low incidence in the northern region, it was hard to make a case for it. But certainly with non-A, non-B, and then Hep C, the balance does, I think, change.
We can take that down. Thank you, Sally.
We should have done more earlier.
That leads neatly to my next question for you, which was about your understanding of hepatitis. Before we look specifically at non-A, non-B hepatitis, if you can go back to your training years in the 1970s, Dr. Lloyd, what can you recall being taught about the risks associated with blood and blood transfusion, in particular, the risks of viral transmission?
I mean, I trained at the Royal Free Hospital, which was sort of the centre of liver disease treatment and investigation. So we knew a little bit about it. I was, I think, aware that there was a problem with patients undergoing cardiac surgery. There was a big cardiac surgery unit in the south of England, in Hertfordshire perhaps, I can't remember now. So we were aware of a problem. At what point between, during my training or beyond that I became aware of that, I'm not sure. It sort of sits somewhere back at the back of my mind that there was this issue. So yes, there was. I had some understanding, and then obviously as I went through particularly my senior registrar training, where I had to read extensively on transfusion issues, it became much more apparent.
We had evidence a few weeks ago from Professor Marcela Contreras, and she told us of writing on chalkboards in the classrooms of medical students the words to the effect, "blood can kill." And obviously there may be a range of reasons why that might be the case, not limited to, but including viral transmission. Mm-hmm. Was that sense of needing to be aware of the dangers of the use of blood and blood products very much part of the thinking at the Northern Regional Transfusion Centre in the 80s? Or was it not?
Oh. Trying to think what it was like before I was director, when I was just around as registrar. It wasn't a terrific I don't sort of see that message up on the chalkboard. It's dangerous. It was being used relatively freely, and we were still seeing units being given, single unit transfusions and the like. So I don't think there was quite as strong an emphasis as Dr. Contreras, showed where she was teaching students. So perhaps not as significant, no.
And then non-A, non-B hepatitis. Can you recall, as it were, the evolution of your understanding of non-A, non-B hepatitis, both in terms of its incidence as a risk of transfusion and as to its seriousness?
Mm-hmm. Taking the risk of non-A, non-B, a lot of what I knew in the earlier days was material that came from the States, and certainly was aware that there were a lot of differences in the way that donations were collected in the States, the separation between the voluntary side under the umbrella of the AABB and the commercial side. So you got a sense that maybe we're not in as bad a position as they are. And of course we probably weren't, but it wasn't a panacea. We weren't wonderful by a long way. And so you saw that. Then gradually, there one of the documents that has been presented to me was a journal article which studies non-A, non-B in the States, I think certainly in two areas, Texas and New York. Not sure. Anyway, it's an article that you presented, and you read that article and you see people have taken care to develop a study over a long period of time. They've got good information. They've used an independent panel to assess the recipients of blood to see if they had a hepatitis and whether it was significant. And they were able to test large numbers of donations that went to these patients. And they used some fairly sound statistical analyses which showed that there were, the link between the blood and the hepatitis in the patients, there was a link. It was statistically significant. I don't recall seeing that sort of information coming out in the UK. We had some studies, but they were underpowered. They weren't powered to give us the real knowledge we needed. And they didn't make that firm link with the patients who were getting hepatitis. So my knowledge of it sort of developed, I think, relatively slowly. And so I got to a point where I've put it in my witness statement, should we have been doing ALT testing, for instance? Yes, I think we should have been. Was I standing up there shouting from the rooftop saying, should we do it? No, I wasn't, and probably should have done more. But yes, it took the UK, for some reason, the UK seemed to have this attitude that this was not a serious disease and we didn't need to do much about it. We've seen documents, articles which seem to imply that it's not a cost-effective thing to do. There's a lot of information about, we're going to lose too many donors. Well, heck, that's the transfusion centre's job, is to replace the donors with safe donors. That was what we should do. If we lose 1,000 donors, we go and replace them. You take the northern region, we lost thousands and thousands of wonderful donors as the factories, the shipyards, the steelworks closed down. We lost those donors, but we made them up. We made up more numbers from those losses than we would have had to have made up from starting ALT testing. We should have been there. As to its severity, I didn't do a lot of work clinically to actually see it, and obviously you read it. But I was very surprised by Dr. Gunson's comment around the time of HCV introduction, saying that non-A, non-B, or hepatitis C, this hepatitis was not a significant disease. That really surprised me, even then.
And I'll pick up on some of those issues again tomorrow, Dr. Lloyd, when we look in more detail at the introduction of hepatitis C testing. Hepatitis B, now obviously testing for hepatitis B had been in operation long before you joined the centre. Can I just ask you a couple of questions?
No, sorry, can you?
Yes.
Sorry, can you clarify that? You said hepatitis C testing?
Hepatitis B.
Oh,
sorry,
B.
I'm moving to hepatitis
yes.
B. My apologies. So I just wanted to ask you a couple of questions in relation to hepatitis B testing. If we go to NHBT 0072680, this is a letter you wrote in May 1992 to Dr. Castavan at the Freeman Hospital, and it looks like you've been asked a question about...
Can I just point out,
yes.
Sorry, yeah, I please note that is not his correct name. That is a an error on that letter. It's Dr. Kestevan with a K.
Thank you.
But anyway, sorry, Patrick Kestevan. Yes, I do recall this.
Yes, so you'd obviously been asked a question about the position in 1974. And you say, according to our records, for the whole of 1974, we were still testing for hepatitis B antigen using an electrophoretic method. And then you explain it was definitely less sensitive than the assay brought in 1975, probably missing as much as 20% of the hepatitis B positivity in the donor population. Can you recall what had prompted that inquiry? It looks as though it may have been a case of a recipient getting hepatitis B.
Yes, I read this letter. I can't remember what the what letter was sent, came through or question was sent to me about this. I mean, you look at that and say maybe Patrick was being asked to, make a witness statement for for litigation. But it goes back, obviously a lot of years. But no, I don't recall. I'm sorry.
When you first started work at the centre in 1980, do you recall what form of hepatitis B testing was then in use?
No, I don't. I couldn't tell you what the technology was. I mean, I did go into that lab and see it being done, but I can't remember the exact test that was. And
then if we could look at TYWE 000067, please. This is another letter to Croot solicitors, and it refers to you having returned a witness statement, which if we go to page 3, we can see the statement. For present purposes, I just wanted to pick up on something you say on page 7, but if we start at the bottom of page 6, and this was about Dr. Jones again and his choice of commercial produced factor VIII. So you've said, as I understand it, the reasons why Dr. Jones may have preferred commercially produced factor VIII were, and then we've seen 2 of the points already discussed, the reactions and solubility. And then over the page, C is about the characteristics of the commercial product, D about purity. It was E I wanted to ask you about. You say Dr. Jones may have considered that the methods of testing for the presence of the hepatitis B virus were better in the United States. Now, do you know where that thought came from? Was that your own thoughts you were attributing to Dr. Jones, or your understanding of his actual thinking?
I mean, I say that may have considered. So I don't recall Dr. Jones ever saying that to me. But what was my reason for saying that? It was probably, and I only say probably, from discussion with Dr. Collins about this. But I don't think I had anything really firm that I could say that's why I said that. I don't think I can really, say much more on that point.
And do you recall in whether at any point in the 1980s or first half of the 1990s when you were at the centre, do you recall any cases of transfusion-transmitted hepatitis B being drawn to your attention?
I don't remember any. And I know we have, there's sort of two areas there. One is patients who receive blood and regular blood products, and I don't recall having to do any hepatitis B, look-backs. Might be wrong. And probably the cases of hepatitis B in the haemophiliac population, one suspects that that was more an issue with the fractionators rather than the center. And obviously the center produced the plasma, the fractionators converted into finished factor 8, factor 9. So I would imagine that the haemophilia population who developed hepatitis B, that information would have been sort of fed back to say BPL, or if they received commercial product, to the commercial people, manufacturers. And so you may have seen a difference in hepatitis B rates between the two groups, but I wasn't certainly not party to that information. And then
in terms of transfusion-associated hepatitis more generally, so leaving aside whether it's hepatitis B or non-A, non-B hepatitis, was there a system for such infections being notified to the centre, or did it just very much depend upon whether a clinician who had a patient who might have a case of transfusion-associated hepatitis, whether they happened to tell you?
Yeah, I don't think there was any sort of proper setup. It wasn't like there wasn't sort of a document that said, you will inform us. So I suspect that it would have been very ad hoc, and it's quite possible that they just, if it was a non-A, non-B hepatitis, then that there's no point in telling the centre because they're not testing for it, and it is something that could have been done, but no, we didn't do it. But there was certainly non-A, non-B hepatitis around, and you saw that in one of the documents that was presented, which references an article by another Dr. Collins at Freeman Hospital, Dr. Collins and James and a couple of others, who actually followed up a number of cardiac surgery patients who developed hepatitis. So it was around, and I don't recall that information sort of flowing back into the centre.
And if cases of hepatitis or transfusion-associated hepatitis were reported to the centre, was there any body or organisation to whom the centre then had a reporting obligation, as far as you can recall?
Not that I recall, no.
So I'm going to move now to a different topic of relation to the donor selection and donor arrangement. So I wonder whether we take our second break now, and then I can pick that up after the break.
Well, let's do that, shall we, and come back at 4:20. So 4:20, if you please.